Welcome, and prepare yourself for one of the most extraordinary forgotten stories in all of human history. Imagine a civilization so powerful that it brought Babylon to its knees, fought Rameses the Great of Egypt to a standstill, and drafted the oldest known peace treaty in the world, a document so significant that a replica hangs in the United Nations headquarters to this day. And yet, for 3,000 years, this empire vanished so completely from human memory that no one even knew it had existed. The Hittites, lords of the storm god, masters of Bronze Age Anatolia, builders of a military and diplomatic machine that shaped the ancient world, simply disappeared beneath the dust of their own burned capital, until modern archaeologists pulled their clay tablets from the earth and gave them back their voice. This is the complete story of the Hittite Empire, and we are going to follow every step of it together. We will begin long before the Hittites themselves, in the deep foundations of Anatolia, where the ancient Hatti people built sacred cities and buried their kings with bronze sun discs and golden deer figurines at places like Alaka Hoyuk. We will trace the arrival of Assyrian merchants at Kadesh, whose donkey caravans carried tin and textiles across mountain passes, and whose clay tablets gave Anatolia its first written records. We will watch as Indo-European newcomers absorbed Hatti traditions, founded the fortress city of Hattusa among the rugged highlands, and forged a kingdom unlike anything the region had seen. From there, we will follow warrior kings like Hattusili I into the siege camps of Syria, and ride with Mursili I down the Euphrates to sack Babylon itself in 1595 before Christ. We will witness the palace assassinations that nearly destroyed the dynasty and the remarkable edict of Telepinu that tried to impose order through written law. We will see the empire rise again under Suppiluliuma I, who dismantled the Mitanni kingdom and drew even a widowed Egyptian queen to beg for a Hittite prince as pharaoh. We will stand at the Battle of Kadesh, where thousands of chariots clashed along the Orontes River. We will read the words of Queen Puduhepa, one of the most powerful women of the ancient world, and we will walk through the temples of 1,000 gods at the sacred rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya. But we will also follow the cracks as they spread. Grain shortages, Assyrian pressure, Casca raids from the northern mountains, and the terrifying wave of the Sea Peoples. We will watch Hattusa burn around 1180 before Christ, and then discover how Hittite culture survived in successor kingdoms that carried Luwian script and storm god worship into the Iron Age. Finally, we will witness the astonishing moment of rediscovery, when excavations at Bogaskoi in 1906 and the decipherment of Hittite cuneiform in 1915 revealed a superpower that had pioneered international law, religious pluralism, and diplomatic negotiation on a scale unmatched in its era. This matters because the Hittites proved that empires are built not only by swords, but by treaties, by the willingness to absorb other cultures, other gods, other languages, and weave them into something greater. Their story challenges everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. If you enjoy complete journeys through the rise and fall of forgotten civilizations, please subscribe so you never miss our next exploration. Each week, we bring you the full story of a world that shaped history. Now, let us step back more than 4,000 years to the wind-swept plateau of central Anatolia, and let us begin this journey. Long before any king claimed dominion over the highlands, long before chariots thundered across the Syrian plains or treaties were pressed into silver, the land itself was already ancient. The Anatolian plateau rises from the heart of modern Turkey like a vast stone table, ringed by mountains, cut by river gorges, swept by winds that carry the dust of 10,000 years. Here, in the silence before empire, the story begins. Around 7,000 years before the Common Era, in the fertile lowlands south of the plateau, a settlement unlike any other in the world takes shape. Çatalhöyük sprawls across the Konya plain, a dense honeycomb of mud brick houses entered through rooftop openings, their interior walls painted with scenes of leopards, vultures, and the eruption of a distant volcano. Thousands of people live here without streets, without a central temple, without any visible ruler. They bury their dead beneath sleeping platforms, plaster the skulls of ancestors, and fashion small clay figurines of seated women flanked by felines. This is not yet a city in any later sense, but it is something extraordinary, one of the earliest experiments in communal human settlement on Earth. Millennia pass. The Chalcolithic Age brings copper to the plateau. Small villages dot the landscape near sources of ore and obsidian. Settlements grow more defined, more fortified. By the early Bronze Age, around 3,300 years before the Common Era, a network of walled towns begins to emerge across central and northern Anatolia. These are the communities of the Hatti, an indigenous people whose language bears no clear relation to any known family. Their world is organized around fortified hilltop settlements, tells that accumulate layer upon layer of habitation, rising like earthen monuments above the surrounding grain fields. At Çatalhöyük, northeast of what will one day become Hattusa, royal tombs from roughly 2500 to 2200 before the Common Era revealed a civilization of startling sophistication. The dead are laid in stone-lined pits with offerings of breathtaking craftsmanship, bronze sun discs mounted on poles, cast stag figurines with silver inlay, gold vessels, copper standards shaped like bulls and deer. These are not the possessions of simple chieftains. They speak of organized metalworking traditions, long-distance exchange networks, and a religious cosmology centered on solar symbols, sacred animals, and the veneration of the dead. The Hatti worship earth goddesses and weather deities whose names will survive, transformed into the religion of their conquerors. Their sacred sites cluster along the bend of the Kızılırmak River, the longest waterway in Anatolia, whose red-tinged waters carve deep gorges through limestone and volcanic rock. The river defines a natural boundary, a cradle of settlement, a corridor of movement. By the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, Hatti city-states trade copper, silver, and grain among themselves and with Mesopotamia. Their towns feature granaries, workshops, and modest temple precincts. They possess no known writing system of their own, yet their cultural and religious traditions run so deep that the people who will eventually conquer them will adopt their gods, their rituals, their sacred place names, even the very name of the land itself. The newcomers will call their own realm the Land of Hatti, and their capital will bear a Hattic name. The plateau waits. The Bronze Age deepens. Somewhere beyond the mountains to the east, Assyrian merchants are already loading donkeys with tin and woven textiles, preparing for a journey that will bring writing itself to Anatolia and set the stage for the rise of kings. But that transformation lies ahead, for now the land belongs to the Hatti, to their sun discs gleaming above royal graves, to their storm prayers carried on highland winds, to a world that will become the foundation stone of an empire not yet imagined. They arrive from the east, from the ancient city of Assur on the banks of the Tigris, and they come not with armies but with donkeys. Long caravans of them, hundreds at a time, laden with tin from the mountains of Afghanistan and finely woven textiles from Mesopotamian workshops, climbing through the Taurus passes and descending onto the Anatolian plateau. Around 1950 before the Common Era, Assyrian merchants begin establishing a network of trading colonies across central Anatolia that will transform the region forever. They call these outposts Karum, a word meaning port or key, and the greatest of them all rises at the foot of a mound the locals call Kadesh, known today as Kultepe. The Karum at Kadesh sprawls across the lower town beneath the citadel of the local Anatolian ruler. It is a dense quarter of mud brick houses, narrow lanes, and storage rooms packed with goods. The merchants live here as permanent residents, marrying local women, raising bilingual children, yet maintaining their legal identity as citizens of Assur. They operate under a sophisticated commercial code that governs contracts, partnerships, interest rates, and dispute resolution. Letters travel constantly between Kadesh and Assur, carried by messenger along the same donkey routes, creating an astonishing web of correspondence that represents the earliest written records ever found on Anatolian soil. The business model is elegant in its simplicity. Tin and textiles flow westward into Anatolia. Anatolian copper and silver flow eastward to Mesopotamia. The profit margins are extraordinary, sometimes reaching 100% on a single shipment of tin. Merchants form joint stock partnerships, pool capital from investors back in Assur, and maintain meticulous accounts on small clay tablets sealed inside clay envelopes. These envelopes bear cylinder seal impressions that serve as signatures, guaranteeing authenticity. Over 23,000 such tablets have been recovered from Kultepe alone, an archive of staggering richness that reveals not only trade, but daily life, family quarrels, legal disputes, and the texture of a world where Mesopotamian and Anatolian cultures intertwine. At least 40 trading stations spread across the plateau, forming a commercial network that stretches from the Euphrates to the Aegean fringe. Each Karum operates under the authority of the central office at Kadesh, which answers ultimately to the city assembly of Assur. Local Anatolian rulers tolerate and even encourage this presence because the trade enriches them. They levy taxes on goods passing through their territories, and they gain access to tin, the essential ingredient that transforms their abundant copper into bronze. Without the Assyrian merchants, Anatolian rulers cannot arm their soldiers or furnish their palaces with the alloys that define power in this age. But the merchants bring something far more consequential than metal. They bring cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script of Mesopotamia, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. For the first time, the peoples of Anatolia encounter a writing system, and though the earliest tablets are composed in Old Assyrian dialect, the technology of literacy itself takes root. Local scribes begin adapting cuneiform to record their own languages. The seeds of Hittite record-keeping, of royal annals and law codes and treaty archives are planted here in the merchant quarters of Kadesh. Around 1750 before the Common Era, the Karum system collapses. The reasons remain debated: political upheaval among Anatolian kingdoms, disruption of trade routes, shifts in the balance of power across the Near East. The merchant quarters at Kadesh show evidence of destruction and abandonment. The Assyrian traders withdraw, and the flow of correspondence ceases. But the transformation they catalyzed cannot be undone. Anatolia now possesses writing. Its local rulers have tasted the wealth that comes from controlling trade routes and metal supplies. The political landscape is fragmenting and reconsolidating, and from this crucible of commerce and cultural exchange, new ambitions are stirring. Somewhere on the plateau, a dynasty is gathering strength, eyeing the burned and cursed ruins of a city called Hattusa, preparing to claim it as their own. The curse is spoken clearly. Anita, king of Kusara, conquers the city called Hattusa and razes it to the ground. He sows weeds upon its soil and declares that any king who dares resettle this place shall answer to the storm god himself. The text bearing this proclamation, preserved in later Hittite copies, stands as the oldest known document written in the Hittite language. It dates to roughly 1750 before the Common Era, and it records not merely a military victory, but a ritual condemnation. A city erased from the order of legitimate power. Anita rules from Kusara, and for a time his dynasty commands the central plateau. He boasts of conquering Hattush, of defeating its king Piyushti, of gathering the wealth of subject cities into his own storehouses. His realm stretches across the heartland of Anatolia, and the cursed ruins of Hattusa lie silent beneath the highland sky. Yet within a century, something extraordinary occurs. A new dynasty rises, and its founders choose as their capital the very city Anita had damned. The circumstances remain one of the great mysteries of Anatolian history. No surviving text explains who these rulers were or how they justified defying the curse. What is known is that by roughly 1650 before the Common Era, a king bearing the throne name Labana governs from Hattusa, and the city lives again. The name Labana becomes so synonymous with Hittite kingship that later rulers adopt it as a royal title, much as Rome's emperors would later claim the name Caesar. From this point forward, the dynasty and the city are inseparable. The choice of Hattusa is not arbitrary. The site commands a landscape of extraordinary strategic value. Perched on a rocky ridge above a deep gorge, the citadel known as Buyukale rises like a natural fortress, its cliffs falling away on three sides. To the north, the terrain drops sharply toward stream valleys that serve as natural moats. To the south, the ground climbs toward a broad upper plateau that will eventually hold the greatest temple district in Bronze Age Anatolia. The Kızılırmak River, the longest waterway of the peninsula, curves in a great bend around the wider region, creating a natural boundary that shields the Hittite heartland from easy invasion. Springs feed the city. Fertile valleys surround it. Trade routes connecting the plateau to the Black Sea coast and to the passes leading south towards Syria converge nearby. Early fortification walls begin to define the city's perimeter. Massive limestone blocks are fitted together to form defensive circuits around Buyukale, where the royal residence and administrative archives will eventually stand. The Acropolis is compact but formidable, its buildings oriented to exploit the natural rock formations beneath them. Storage facilities suggest a kingdom already thinking in terms of surplus, taxation, and provisioning for war. The emerging state absorbs the cultural inheritance of the Hatti people who preceded it, their gods, their sacred place names, their ritual traditions. while speaking an Indo-European language and organizing power around a warrior aristocracy bound to the king by oaths of loyalty. The early Hittite kingdom is not yet an empire. It is a regional power among rivals, surrounded by competing city-states and threatened by the Kaska peoples who inhabit the mountainous north. But the refounding of Hattusa represents a decisive act of political will. A dynasty has planted itself on cursed ground and declared that ground sacred. The storm god, far from punishing the transgression, becomes the patron deity of the new kingdom. The city grows outward from its rocky core, and the administrative machinery of a centralized state begins to take shape. Scribes recording in cuneiform, officials managing grain stores, commanders marshalling chariot crews. Hattusa is no longer a ruin. It is a capital, and the kings who rule from its citadel are preparing to reach far beyond the plateau. The king who transforms Hattusa from a regional stronghold into something far more dangerous bears the name of the city itself. Hattusili, the first of that name, ascends to power around 1650 before the Common Era, and from the moment he takes the throne, the Anatolian plateau is no longer large enough to contain his ambition. He looks south, beyond the Taurus mountain passes, toward the wealthy cities of northern Syria, where trade routes converge and grain flows in abundance. The campaigns he launches will define the character of the Old Kingdom and announce to the wider world that a new power has risen in the highlands. Hattusili moves with calculated aggression. His armies cross the Taurus passes and descend into the plains where Aleppo and its network of allied cities dominate the political landscape. The city of Alalak, a prosperous center along the Orontes River Valley, falls to Hittite forces. Its destruction sends a clear signal across Syria. The mountain kingdom to the north is no longer content to manage its own plateau. Hattusili presses deeper, striking at cities that owe allegiance to Aleppo, dismantling the regional order piece by piece. His annals, preserved in both Hittite and Akkadian on cuneiform tablets, record these campaigns with a directness that reveals both pride and strategic calculation. He names the cities he conquers, the plunder he carries home, the resistance he crushes. Yet the Syrian campaigns are grueling. Aleppo itself, the great prize, proves stubbornly resistant. Hattusili besieges the city but cannot take it during his own lifetime. The kingdom of Yamhad, centered on Aleppo, remains a formidable adversary, its alliances deep and its fortifications strong. Meanwhile, threats multiply closer to home. The Hurrians press from the southeast, and the ever-restless Kaska peoples raid from the northern mountains. Hattusili fights on multiple fronts, stretching his forces across vast distances in an age when communication depends on runners and the speed of chariot teams. What distinguishes this king beyond his military reach is the remarkable document he leaves behind, a political testament that reveals the inner workings of Hittite royal succession in all its fragility. Hattusili had originally designated a nephew as heir, but the young man proved disloyal, conspiring against the throne. The king revokes the appointment with bitter words preserved on clay, describing betrayal and ingratitude. In place of the failed heir, Hattusili adopts his grandson Mursili, still young, and presents him before the assembled nobles with instructions to guide and protect the boy. The text is extraordinary, part personal confession, part constitutional decree, part warning to the court. It reveals a monarchy that depends not on automatic inheritance, but on the king's judgment, ratified by an assembly of warriors and officials. The royal seal impressions from this period show the growing sophistication of Hittite administration. Cylinder seals and stamp seals bear the king's name alongside divine symbols, linking political authority to sacred legitimacy. The storm god stands behind the throne, and every military victory is framed as divine favor earned through piety and strength. Hattusa dies around 1620 before the Common Era, his great enemy Aleppo still unconquered but weakened. He leaves behind a kingdom vastly expanded from what he inherited, its influence now reaching deep into Syria, its armies tested across mountain and plain, its administrative systems growing more complex with each campaign. The chariot crews that roll south through the Cilician gates carry bronze weapons forged on the plateau, and the scribes who accompany them record everything in the wedge-shaped script, borrowed from Mesopotamia, but now serving a distinctly Anatolian power. The young Mursili, raised in the shadow of his grandfather's ambition, inherits not just a throne, but an unfinished war and a court full of rivals watching to see whether the boy can hold what the lion unleashed. The boy proves more than capable. Mursili, barely past adolescence when he takes the throne, moves first against the enemy his grandfather could never finish. He marches south through the Taurus passes with an army hardened by years of frontier warfare, and Aleppo, the great Syrian stronghold that had defied Hattusa for decades, finally falls. The city that controlled the crossroads between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean is taken, its walls breached, its king humbled. It is a significant victory, one that would have secured any young ruler's reputation. But Mursili does not stop. What follows is one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in all of ancient history. Rather than consolidating his hold on northern Syria, Mursili turns his army southeast and drives down the Euphrates River valley, pushing deeper into Mesopotamian territory than any Anatolian king has ever ventured. The distance is staggering, more than 1,000 kilometers from Hattusa to the target that lies at the end of this march. The army moves along the river, through lands controlled by Hurrian populations and petty kingdoms too stunned or too weak to resist. Supply lines stretch impossibly thin across alien terrain. And still the columns press forward, chariots and infantry following the great river south toward the richest city in the known world. Babylon, the seat of Hammurabi's dynasty, the city of towering ziggurats and ancient learning, the symbolic heart of Mesopotamian civilization. In 1595, before the Common Era, Mursili's forces storm the city. The Amorite dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries collapses in a single devastating assault. The sacred statue of the god Marduk is seized, treasures are plundered, and the political order of southern Mesopotamia is shattered. It is not an occupation. The Hittites have no intention of holding a city so impossibly far from their highland homeland. It is a raid of breathtaking audacity, a demonstration of military reach that reverberates across the entire ancient Near East. The Kassites, a mountain people from the Zagros region, eventually fill the power vacuum in Babylon. Mursili withdraws northward with his plunder and his glory, having accomplished something no Anatolian ruler will ever repeat. The young king returns to Hattusa at the apex of prestige, his empire stretching from the central plateau deep into Syria, his name spoken with fear from the Tigris to the Mediterranean. But the palace that welcomes him home is poisoned with ambition. The very success of the campaign has made Mursili dangerous to those who covet his throne. His brother-in-law Huntili and a court official named Zidanta conspire in the shadows of the citadel. The details preserved in later texts are sparse but brutal. Mursili is assassinated, cut down not by a foreign enemy, but by members of his own royal household. The king who sacked Babylon dies at the hands of men who shared his table. The murder unleashes a cascade of violence that will consume the Hittite court for generations. Huntili seizes the throne but finds no peace upon it. Zidanta, his co-conspirator, eventually turns against him. Sons are murdered, rivals are blinded. Each new king takes power through blood and treachery, only to fall to the same methods. The great archive tablets from later periods record this era with a tone approaching horror, a kingdom devouring itself from within while external enemies press closer. The Kaska tribes raid northern territories with increasing boldness. Syrian vassals drift away from Hittite control. The extraordinary gains of Hattusili and Mursili begin to erode as the throne becomes a death sentence rather than a prize. The empire that had projected power all the way to Babylon now struggles to defend its own heartland. The lesson is carved into the institutional memory of the Hittite state, that unchecked succession violence can destroy what even the greatest military campaigns cannot build. Somewhere in the burned tablets and broken seals of this bloody period lies the seed of a constitutional response that will eventually reshape how Hittite kings claim and hold their power. That seed germinates in blood. The generations following Mursili's assassination witness a pattern so relentless it threatens to unmake the kingdom entirely. Kings are murdered by their own courtiers, by brothers-in-law, by sons who cannot wait for natural succession. Each new ruler ascends over the body of his predecessor, and each in turn watches the shadows of his own court for the blade that will end his reign. The throne room at Hattusa becomes less a seat of governance than a stage for recurring tragedy. The details survive in fragments, but the pattern is unmistakable. Huntili, who conspired in the murder of Mursili, rules for years, but cannot escape the violence he helped unleash. His own family members are killed. His successor, Zidanta, implicated in yet another assassination, meets the same fate at the hands of his own son Amuna. And Amuna's reign brings no stability. The kingdom contracts, harvests fail, and the gods themselves are said to turn away from Hatti. The sacred festivals go unperformed, the granaries empty. Provincial governors begin acting as independent rulers, while the capital consumes itself in factional warfare. By the time Telepinu comes to power around 1525, before the Common Era, the Hittite state has endured nearly a century of dynastic murder. He himself seizes the throne through force, deposing and exiling his predecessor. But Telepinu possesses something his predecessors lacked: the clarity to recognize that the kingdom's greatest enemy is not the Kaska, not Aleppo, not any foreign power, but the very mechanism by which its own kings are made and unmade. His response is extraordinary. Telepinu issues a proclamation that later generations will preserve and copy with care. The text recounts the bloody history of the dynasty in unflinching detail, naming the murders, the conspirators, the consequences. It reads almost as a legal indictment of the Hittite monarchy itself. Then it establishes new rules. Succession must follow a clear order: first the sons of the primary queen, then secondary sons, then sons-in-law. No prince may kill a brother. No faction may murder its way to legitimacy. Those who violate these principles must answer not to the king alone, but to the Pancus, the assembly of nobles and high officials who serve as a judicial body. The Pancus itself represents something remarkable in the Bronze Age world. It functions as a constitutional check on royal power, a body that can hear cases of royal misconduct and render judgment. Telepinu does not abolish the monarchy, he constrains it. He binds future kings to a framework of law that exists above any single ruler's will. The concept that a king might be subject to rules he did not create and cannot unilaterally change is, in this era, virtually without parallel. The edict's cuneiform tablets are preserved in the archives of Hattusa, their careful script recording provisions that extend beyond succession. Property rights, judicial procedures, and penalties for crimes are codified. The death penalty, applied liberally in other contemporary legal systems, is restricted. Telepinu favors restitution and compensation over execution, a legal philosophy that distinguishes Hittite justice from the harsher codes of Mesopotamia. Telepinu's own reign remains modest in military terms. He campaigns in southeastern Anatolia and secures a treaty with the kingdom of Kidzuwatna, stabilizing the southern frontier through diplomacy rather than conquest. The territorial losses of previous decades are not fully reversed. But the institutional framework he establishes proves more durable than any battlefield victory. The edict becomes a foundational document, referenced and invoked by later kings who understand that their legitimacy rests not merely on divine favor or military strength, but on adherence to a constitutional tradition. The kingdom that emerges from Telepinu's reforms is chastened, smaller and quieter than the realm that once sacked Babylon. But it is alive. The succession mechanism, imperfect as it remains in practice, reduces the frequency of outright regicide. The Pancus endures as an institution. The principle that law governs even the powerful becomes embedded in Hittite political culture. In the decades that follow, the kingdom enters a period of relative obscurity, its power diminished, its borders pressured. Yet the constitutional architecture Telepinu raised from the wreckage of a century of murder will provide the scaffolding upon which later, greater kings will rebuild. The scaffolding holds, but the structure it supports grows ever more fragile. The decades after Telepinu's reign dissolve into a murk that even the cuneiform record cannot fully illuminate. Tablets from this era survive only in fragments, king lists contradict one another, and the names of rulers blur into uncertainty. What emerges from the silence is not a story of ambition, but of contraction, a kingdom slowly losing its grip on the world it once commanded. The Hittite heartland itself comes under siege from an enemy that possesses no empire, no written tradition, no centralized state, yet proves devastatingly effective. The Kaska peoples inhabit the forested mountains along the Black Sea coast, north of Hattusa, and they raid with a persistence that no punitive campaign can extinguish. They burn villages, scatter garrisons, and withdraw into highlands where chariots cannot follow. Season after season, Hittite farmers on the northern plateau watch smoke rise from neighboring settlements. Defensive walls thicken, watchtowers multiply along ridge lines. Yet the Kaska return, always, filtering through valleys and passes that no fortification line can fully seal. At times they press so close to the capital that Hattusa itself feels the threat, its granaries strained by refugees and its military stretched between too many frontiers. To the southeast, a far more organized power fills the vacuum the Hittites once dominated. The kingdom of Mitanni, ruled by an Indo-Aryan warrior aristocracy governing a Hurrian population, consolidates control over northern Mesopotamia and Syria. The vassal states that Hattusili I and Mursili I bled to conquer now answer to Mitanni overlords. Aleppo, the prize that cost the Old Kingdom so dearly, slips entirely from Hittite influence. The great trade routes linking Anatolia to the wealth of Syria and Mesopotamia narrow or close. Diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals Mitanni treating with Egypt as an equal, exchanging princesses and gold, while the Hittite king receives no such recognition. The geopolitical architecture of the Near East reorganizes itself around a Mitanni-Egyptian axis, and Hattusa finds itself marginalized. Within the kingdom, the succession crises that Telepinu sought to end do not vanish entirely. Several rulers from this period are known only from seal impressions or passing references in later texts. Their reigns appear brief, their achievements modest. The administrative apparatus continues to function, taxes are collected, temples maintained, festivals observed, but the energy that once propelled armies down the Euphrates has dissipated. Provincial governors exercise greater autonomy. The Western territories, where Arzawa and other Luwian-speaking kingdoms assert independence, drift beyond effective royal control. Yet even in this diminished state, the kingdom does not collapse. The institutions Telepinu codified provide a skeleton of governance that survives weak kings and external pressure alike. The scribal schools of Hattusa continue copying texts, preserving legal traditions and religious knowledge. The great temple of the storm god still receives offerings. Farmers still plant barley on the plateau each spring, and the seasonal rhythm of ploughing, harvest, and festival persists beneath the political turbulence. This persistence matters profoundly. The Hittite Middle Kingdom endures not through conquest or brilliance, but through institutional resilience, through the quiet stubbornness of a bureaucratic and religious tradition that outlasts the men who nominally lead it. The kingdom contracts to its Anatolian core, loses its Syrian empire, and suffers constant harassment from enemies it cannot decisively defeat. But it survives, and survival, across 7 decades of obscurity and pressure, preserves the possibility of revival. Somewhere around 1430 before the Common Era, a king named Tudaliya ascends to a throne that commands far less than it once did. He inherits a diminished realm, hostile borders on every side, and an army in need of reform. He also inherits something his predecessors nearly squandered: a state that still functions, a capital that still stands, and a tradition of kingship that still carries meaning. From this unpromising foundation, everything will be rebuilt. Tudaliya inherits a kingdom that remembers greatness, but can no longer claim it. The borders have contracted to the central Anatolian plateau. The vassal network that once extended Hittite influence into northern Syria has disintegrated. Mitanni dominates the southeast. The Kaska tribes continue their relentless pressure from the Pontic highlands, raiding settlements and burning frontier posts with an almost seasonal regularity. To the west, the lands of Arzawa have grown into a confederation powerful enough to conduct independent diplomacy with Egypt, bypassing Hattusa entirely. The new king faces encirclement. What distinguishes Tudaliya from his immediate predecessors is not merely ambition, but method. He begins with the army. The chariot corps, backbone of every major Bronze Age military, undergoes systematic reorganization. Crews are drilled in coordinated maneuver rather than individual combat. The ratio of infantry to chariot units is recalibrated for the mountainous terrain of western Anatolia, where massed chariot charges prove less effective than in the flat Syrian plains. Garrison networks along the Kaska frontier are strengthened, not with grand fortifications, but with smaller, more numerous outposts designed for rapid communication and mutual reinforcement. Hattusa itself sees renewed construction. Walls are repaired, granaries expanded, and the administrative apparatus of the citadel at Boyokale reorganized to handle the correspondence and logistics of campaigns on multiple fronts. The Western campaigns define the early phase of this revival. The Assyria Confederation, a coalition of some 22 Western Anatolian states, rises against Hittite claims of overlordship. Tudalia marches west and defeats the Confederation in a campaign that reasserts Hittite authority over territories stretching toward the Aegean coast. Prisoners are taken in significant numbers. Among the spoils recorded in later tradition are references to place names that tantalize modern scholars with possible connections to Homeric geography. The victory does not permanently pacify the West, but it announces that Hattusa is no longer a power in retreat. The Azawa lands prove more stubborn. These Luwian-speaking kingdoms in southwestern Anatolia have developed their own political sophistication during the decades of Hittite weakness. Their rulers correspond with foreign courts as equals. Tudalia campaigns against them repeatedly, achieving tactical victories without fully incorporating them into a stable vassal framework. The struggle with Azawa will persist across generations, but the critical shift occurs now. Hattusa moves from defensive survival to offensive reassertion. Diplomatic correspondence resumes on a scale not seen since the Old Kingdom. Treaties are drafted with renewed precision, drawing on the legal traditions preserved through the dark decades. The language of vassalage is refined, obligations codified, divine witnesses invoked with elaborate care. The Hittite chancellery begins producing documents in multiple languages and scripts, reflecting an empire that must communicate across linguistic boundaries. Akkadian cuneiform serves for international correspondence. Hittite cuneiform handles internal administration. Luwian hieroglyphs appear on seals and monumental inscriptions with increasing frequency, reflecting the demographic reality of an empire whose western and southern populations speak Luwian dialects. The religious establishment undergoes parallel renewal. Temple inventories are updated. Festival calendars disrupted during the years of contraction are restored. The king reasserts his role as chief priest, personally presiding over seasonal rituals that bind the divine order to the political one. At Hattusa, the great temple district continues to grow, its storerooms filled with offerings that double as state reserves. Tudalia does not live to see the full fruits of this restoration. The kings who follow him in the later 14th century before the Common Era will build upon his military reforms, his diplomatic frameworks, and his administrative reorganization to create something genuinely imperial. But the turning point belongs to this reign. A kingdom that had spent decades losing territory, losing vassals, and losing relevance reverses its trajectory within a single generation. The army that marches west against Assyria and south against Azawa carries weapons forged in the same workshops that served earlier kings, but it fights with a discipline and coordination that reflects conscious institutional reform. The scribes who draft new treaties work from templates their predecessors created, but they adapt them to a world that has changed. From this restored foundation, a king will soon arise whose conquests reshape the entire ancient Near East. His name is Suppiluliuma, and the empire he inherits from Tudhaliya's legacy will become the most powerful state Anatolia has ever known. Suppiluliuma ascends to the throne around 1350 before the Common Era, and the world he inherits is ripe for conquest. The Mitanni kingdom, once the dominant force across Upper Mesopotamia and northern Syria, has fractured under dynastic civil war. Its vassal network stretches thin, its alliances with Egypt grown stale, its military capacity hollowed by internal bleeding. Suppiluliuma reads this weakness with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a predator. He does not strike immediately. The early years of his reign are spent consolidating the Anatolian heartland, securing the northern frontier against the Kaska, and rebuilding Hattusa's fortifications on a scale that dwarfs anything his predecessors attempted. The great walls rise higher, the grain magazines deepen, the chariot corps expands. Every preparation points toward Syria. When the campaign finally comes, it unfolds with devastating speed. Suppiluliuma leads his forces across the Taurus passes and descends into the plains that Mitanni has controlled for generations. One by one, the Syrian vassal states that had sworn loyalty to Mitanni or maintained cautious ties with Egypt are detached, besieged, or persuaded into the Hittite orbit. Aleppo falls. Alalak falls. The ancient trading centers of the Orontes Valley submit. Suppiluliuma installs his own sons as vassal kings in the most critical cities. One prince takes the throne of Aleppo. Another receives Carchemish, the great crossing point on the Euphrates, the hinge between Anatolia and Mesopotamia. These are not temporary garrisons, but dynastic implantations designed to last generations. The Mitanni heartland collapses. Washukani, the Mitanni capital, is reduced to a shadow. What remains of Mitanni becomes a buffer squeezed between Hittite ambition and rising Assyrian hunger. The entire balance of power across the ancient Near East shifts in a single reign. It is during this upheaval that the most extraordinary diplomatic episode of the Bronze Age unfolds. A letter arrives at Hattusa from Egypt, from a queen whose pharaoh has recently died. She writes that she has no son, that she fears being forced to marry a servant, and she asks Suppiluliuma to send one of his sons to become her husband and Egypt's king. The Hittite monarch is stunned. Nothing in the long history of Near Eastern diplomacy has precedent for this. He sends an envoy to verify the offer. The queen writes again, this time with unmistakable urgency and indignation at his hesitation. Suppiluliuma relents. He dispatches his son Zananza southward toward Egypt. The prince never arrives. He is murdered on the journey, almost certainly by Egyptian court factions unwilling to accept a foreign king. The grief and fury that seize Suppiluliuma are recorded in the texts his scribes preserve. He launches retaliatory raids into Egyptian-held territory in southern Syria, and his soldiers bring back prisoners. Those prisoners carry something invisible and catastrophic. A plague erupts among the Hittite forces and spreads back into the Anatolian heartland. It ravages the population for years, killing Suppiluliuma himself around 1322 before the Common Era, and claiming his immediate successor shortly after. The pestilence becomes so devastating that later kings compose prayers begging the gods for relief, explicitly connecting the plague to the Egyptian prisoners and the broken order of that failed diplomatic gambit. Yet even plague cannot undo what Suppiluliuma has built. The Syrian provinces remain under Hittite dynastic control. Carchemish and Aleppo continue as pillars of imperial administration. The vassal treaty system he perfected becomes the template for Hittite governance across the next century. The cuneiform archives swell with correspondence in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca, connecting Hattusa to every major court from Babylon to the Nile. The Amarna letters found in Egypt preserve fragments of this web, revealing a world where great kings address each other as brothers and negotiate marriages, trade agreements, and territorial boundaries with elaborate protocol. Sapululiuma transforms the Hittite state from a regional Anatolian power into a true empire spanning from the Aegean frontier to the Euphrates. The cost is enormous. The plague thins the population, the military commitments strain resources, and the very success of his conquests creates obligations his successors must sustain against rivals who grow stronger with each passing decade. The empire he leaves behind is magnificent and vulnerable in equal measure, a colossus standing at the center of a world that will soon demand everything it has. That colossus, magnificent and vulnerable, does not stand alone. It stands within a cosmos governed by 1,000 gods, and every stone of its architecture, every campaign of its armies, every harvest gathered from the plateau serves ultimately at divine pleasure. The Hittite Empire is, at its deepest foundation, a theological enterprise. The king rules not by right of blood alone, but as chief servant of the gods, and the entire apparatus of state exists to maintain the sacred compact between heaven and earth. The pantheon defies simple cataloguing. Centuries of absorption have layered Hatti, Hurrian, Luwian, and Mesopotamian deities into a vast and sometimes contradictory assembly. At its apex stand two great figures. The storm god, known by his Hurrian name Teshub and his Hattian name Toru, commands the weather that determines whether the plateau's thin soils yield grain or dust. His consort, the sun goddess of Arinna, holds primacy in matters of sovereignty and kingship. Together they anchor a divine hierarchy that extends downward through hundreds of local gods, mountain spirits, river deities, and underworld powers, each demanding specific rites, offerings, and festivals. Hattusa itself is built to house this divine multitude. The great temple district in the lower city spreads across an area rivaling the royal citadel above. Temple 1, dedicated to the storm god and the sun goddess, dominates the precinct. Its massive limestone foundations enclose storerooms packed with enormous clay vessels holding grain, oil, and wine, provisions not merely for priests, but for the gods themselves, who consume through ritual what the land provides through labor. Surrounding this central sanctuary, more than 30 additional temples crowd the lower city, each serving its own deity, each maintaining its own priesthood, its own calendar of offerings. Beyond the capital walls, carved into a natural rock outcrop less than 2 kilometers northeast, lies Yazulakaya. This open-air sanctuary channels worshippers through narrow limestone corridors into 2 chambers where processions of deities march in carved relief across the living rock. In the larger chamber, male gods advance from the left, female gods from the right, converging at a central panel where Teshub and the sun goddess meet in divine congress. The smaller chamber holds images associated with the underworld and the deified dead, a space where kingship touches mortality. The sacred calendar binds the empire's year into a continuous cycle of obligation. The great spring festival known as the Antashum festival stretches across 38 days, requiring the king to travel between temples and sacred sites, performing purification rites, offering bread and libations, and reciting prayers that renew the bond between the land and its divine protectors. The Puruli festival, rooted in Hattian tradition, reenacts the storm god's victory over the serpent Iluyanka, a mythic narrative of cosmic order triumphing over chaos. Dozens of smaller festivals punctuate the months between, each demanding the king's physical presence. This obligation is not ceremonial decoration. Cult inventories recovered from the archives reveal an administration obsessed with maintaining proper worship. Tablets catalogue which gods receive, which animals, which temples lack adequate personnel, which festivals have fallen into neglect during wartime. When rituals lapse, the gods withdraw their protection, and drought, plague, and military defeat follow. The plague prayers composed after Suppiluliuma's campaigns confess national sin with striking candor, acknowledging that divine anger has real and devastating consequences. The priesthood forms a parallel bureaucracy alongside the secular administration. Temple personnel include not only priests and priestesses, but musicians, cooks, sweepers, and craftsmen dedicated to maintaining sacred spaces. Women hold significant religious authority. The queen herself carries the title Tawanana and performs essential cultic functions independent of the king. Priestesses at major sanctuaries wield influence that extends well beyond temple walls. Religious pluralism operates as imperial policy. Conquered peoples keep their gods, and those gods enter the Hittite pantheon, bound by treaty and ritual into the empire's sacred order. Every vassal agreement invokes divine witnesses from both parties, creating a theological architecture that mirrors the political one. The 1,000 gods of Hatti are not merely worshipped. They are the empire's constitution, its legitimacy, and its deepest claim upon the future. That sacred constitution finds its earthly mirror in clay. Within the citadel of Buyukale, perched on the highest rock of Hattusa, scribes maintain an archive of staggering ambition. Thousands of tablets line the storerooms, organized not by accident, but by bureaucratic logic. Treaties occupy one section, religious inventories another, royal correspondence yet another. The empire governs itself through written law, and the men who press reed stylus into wet clay are among its most essential servants. The Hittite law code survives in copies dating to the New Kingdom, though its origins reach back centuries earlier. 200 provisions address matters from murder to irrigation rights, from the price of a plough ox to the punishment for sorcery. What distinguishes these laws from their Mesopotamian predecessors is a persistent inclination toward compensation over retribution. Where older codes demand an eye for an eye, Hittite law frequently substitutes payment in silver. A free person who blinds another owes 20 shekels. A slave's injury carries a lesser but still codified penalty. The distinction between intentional and accidental harm matters here. A death caused by negligence draws a different consequence than one caused by malice. This is not modern justice, but it is a recognizable ancestor of proportional sentencing. Land tenure binds the population to the state with equal precision. The king holds ultimate ownership of all territory, but grants parcels to individuals and institutions in exchange for obligations. A landholder who receives a field must provide military service, labor for public works, or tax in grain and livestock. These obligations attach to the land itself, not merely to the person. When a field changes hands, the duties transfer with it. Elaborate documents record each grant, specifying boundaries, obligations, and the consequences of abandonment. If a holder flees and the land lies fallow for 3 years, the community may reassign it. The vassal treaty system extends this logic beyond Anatolia's borders. Each conquered or allied kingdom receives a document dictating its relationship to the great king. These treaties follow a remarkably consistent structure. A historical preamble recounts how the Hittite king came to power over the vassal. Stipulations define military contributions, extradition of fugitives, trade restrictions, and loyalty oaths. Divine witnesses from both pantheons seal the agreement, and elaborate curses threaten any party who violates the terms. The treaty with the Kingdom of Ugarit specifies grain shipments. The treaty binding Amuru demands exclusive military allegiance. Each document is tailored, yet each follows the same institutional grammar. Scribal culture sustains this machinery. Hittite scribes write in at least 3 languages. Akkadian serves as the diplomatic lingua franca, used in correspondence with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. Hittite cuneiform records laws, prayers, and royal annals. Luwian hieroglyphs carved into seals and monumental stone carry royal names and dedications across the empire's southern and western provinces. Some scribes also copy Sumerian texts for scholarly purposes, and Hurrian appears in religious contexts. This multilingual competence is not ornamental. It is the nervous system of an empire spanning diverse peoples who speak different tongues and worship different gods. Seal impressions authenticate every transaction. The royal seal bears the winged sun disk, and the king's name in both cuneiform and hieroglyphic Luwian, a deliberate bilingualism that communicates authority to literate and semi-literate audiences alike. Officials carry their own seals, and the impression of a seal on a tablet's clay envelope transforms a document from mere writing into binding law. The archive rooms of Büyükkale thus contain something more than records. They contain the operating system of a state that governs through written obligation rather than personal charisma alone. Every treaty, every land grant, every legal verdict pressed into clay represents a choice to bind power within predictable structures. The empire's strength lies not only in its chariots and its gods, but in its conviction that governance itself can be inscribed, stored, consulted, and enforced across generations and across the vast distances between Hattusa and its most distant vassal capitals. But those tablets, for all their legal precision, describe a world built on soil and sweat. Beyond the citadel walls, beyond the temple precincts and the archive rooms, the empire rests on the labor of ordinary hands. Farmers who coax grain from a landscape that yields nothing easily, soldiers who march when summoned, artisans who shape bronze and clay and wool into the material fabric of Hittite civilization. The central Anatolian plateau is a demanding homeland. Summers burn dry and hot across the steppe grasslands. Winters descend with bitter cold and heavy snow that locks villages into isolation for months. Rainfall is unpredictable, concentrated in spring, and the margin between a successful harvest and famine remains perilously thin throughout the empire's existence. Yet the Hittites cultivate this land with disciplined knowledge. Barley dominates the lower elevations where moisture is scarce, its hardiness making it the staple grain of the plateau. Wheat grows where irrigation or reliable rainfall permits, particularly in the river valleys that cut through the highlands. orchards of fruit trees and vineyards appear in sheltered lowlands, and the texts record careful attention to grape cultivation and wine production for both consumption and ritual offering. Cattle, sheep, and goats form the second pillar of the agricultural economy. Sheep provide wool, the single most important textile fiber, while cattle serve as draft animals for the heavy wooden plows that break the plateau's stubborn earth each spring. Household inventories preserved in the archives list animals alongside land allotments, and the law code prescribes specific compensations for stolen or injured livestock, calibrated precisely by the animal's type and productive value. A plough ox commands a higher penalty than a pasture cow, reflecting its irreplaceable role in cultivation. The grain silos of Hattusa stand as monumental testimony to the state's dependence on stored surplus. Massive underground chambers carved into bedrock and lined with stone hold thousands of tons of grain, enough to sustain the capital through siege or drought. These are not private stores, but state infrastructure, managed by palace administrators who track contributions from surrounding agricultural districts. The empire feeds its army, its priests, its craftsmen, and its bureaucracy from this centralized reserve. Military obligation falls directly upon the farming population. The Sahun and Luzi service systems require landholders to provide either military duty or corvée labor to the state in proportion to their holdings. When campaigns are declared, farmers become soldiers, shouldering spears and marching alongside professional garrison troops. The law code specifies that a man called to war must go or provide a substitute, and the obligations extend across social classes, binding even prosperous landowners to the crown's military needs. Within the towns, craft specialization reaches impressive sophistication. Potters produce a distinctive repertoire of vessels, elegant beaked pitchers, ritual bull-shaped drinking cups, and utilitarian storage jars fired in communal kilns. Bronze workers cast tools, weapons, pins, and figurines using copper from Anatolian mines alloyed with tin imported through long-distance trade networks. Textile production, largely the work of women, transforms raw wool through spinning and weaving into cloth that serves as both clothing and a medium of economic exchange. Loom weights recovered from household floors across dozens of sites confirm that weaving occurs in nearly every dwelling, making it the most widespread craft in the empire. Family law governs this working world with notable balance. Marriage requires a bride price paid to the woman's family, but women retain certain property rights and can initiate divorce under specific circumstances outlined in the law code. Widows inherit, daughters can receive land, and the household functions as both an economic and a legal unit recognized by the state. This is the empire's true foundation, not the grand treaties or the chariot charges, but the turning of soil each spring, the shearing of sheep, the rhythmic clack of looms in dim stone rooms, and the slow firing of clay in hillside kilns. Every tablet sealed in the archive, every temple provisioned for festival, every soldier equipped for campaign depends upon this vast, quiet engine of daily labor spread across the plateau's villages and towns, sustaining a civilization that the wider world knows only by its kings and its wars. Yet that quiet engine of labor serves a machine far less gentle. From every village and provincial town, the empire draws its fighting strength, not through a standing professional army alone, but through a vast system of military obligation woven into the fabric of landholding itself. Every grant of farmland recorded on those cuneiform tablets carries with it a duty. When the great king calls, men must answer, bringing their own weapons, their own provisions, and their own readiness to march. The Hittite army that assembles for campaign is a composite force. At its core stand the Royal Guard units stationed permanently at Hattusa, professional soldiers trained in the citadel's shadow. Around them gather levies drawn from across the plateau and from vassal states bound by treaty to supply contingents. A major campaign can draw forces from dozens of subordinate kingdoms, each contributing infantry, charioteers, or supply trains according to the terms inscribed in their oath tablets. These military oath texts are binding sacred contracts. Soldiers swear before the gods that they will not desert, will not conspire, will not turn their weapons against the king. The penalties for violation are not merely legal, but cosmic, invoking divine destruction upon the oath-breaker and his entire household. The infantry forms the army's mass. Soldiers carry bronze-tipped spears, short stabbing swords, and curved sickle-shaped blades. Shields are rectangular or figure-eight shaped, constructed from wood and leather. Helmets of bronze or boiled leather protect the skull. These men fight in disciplined formations, holding ground while the decisive arm of Hittite warfare does its work. That decisive arm is the chariot. Where Egypt and other powers deploy two-man chariots, a driver and an archer, the Hittites field a heavier vehicle crewed by three: a driver, a warrior armed with a long thrusting spear, and a shield-bearer who protects both companions. This configuration transforms the chariot from a mobile archery platform into a shock weapon. Hittite chariots charge directly into enemy formations, the spearman striking downward from the platform while the shield-bearer deflects incoming missiles. The heavier crew requires a sturdier vehicle with reinforced axles and wider wheelbases, and the horses that draw them are bred and trained with extraordinary care. Following detailed manuals preserved in the archives, the famous Kikuli text prescribes conditioning regimens spanning months. Siege warfare presents different challenges across the empire's mountainous terrain. Hittite forces employ battering rams, earthen ramps piled against fortification walls, and the patient strategy of encirclement and starvation. The rugged Anatolian landscape makes supply lines precarious, and campaigns into Syria require crossing mountain passes where ambush is constant threat. Military logistics depend on grain stores positioned along established routes, on river crossings secured in advance, and on the cooperation of vassal states whose territories the army must traverse. The frontier garrison system anchors the empire's defense. Along the northern border, where Casca raiders descend from forested highlands in relentless seasonal attacks, the Hittites maintain a chain of fortified outposts. These garrisons are not merely military installations, but administrative centers, collecting intelligence, managing local populations, and serving as the first line of response when raids strike. Garrison commanders hold significant authority, and their correspondence with the capital reveals a constant tension between the resources available and the threats they face. The Casca frontier is never truly pacified. It is managed, contained, endured. Campaign season follows the agricultural calendar. Armies march after the spring harvest provides grain for supply trains, and before autumn rains turn mountain roads to mud. The great king himself often leads major expeditions, his presence a religious and political necessity. The gods march with the king, and victory confirms divine favor. Before battle, priests perform elaborate rituals, examining the entrails of sacrificed animals for omens, consulting oracles, ensuring that the 1,000 gods of Hatti sanction the bloodshed to come. This military apparatus, oath-bound, chariot-driven, garrisoned along vulnerable frontiers, and sanctified by ritual, is what projects Hittite power across hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain, from the plateau's heart to the banks of the Orontes. It is the instrument that will soon be tested at the greatest scale the Bronze Age world has ever witnessed. That instrument meets its supreme trial in the spring of 1274 before the Common Era, on the banks of the Orontes River in western Syria, where the ancient city of Kadesh commands a strategic crossroads between Egyptian and Hittite spheres of influence. The great king Muwatalli II has spent months assembling the largest coalition force the Hittite world has ever fielded. Some 37,000 troops drawn from across the empire and its vassals, including contingents from Aleppo, Ugarit, Kidzuwatna, and the distant western lands of Arzawa. At the heart of this host ride approximately 3,500 chariots, each carrying the distinctive Hittite crew of 3, driver, shield-bearer, and warrior armed with a thrusting spear. Muwatalli does not intend a frontal collision. He conceals his entire army behind the Tell of Kadesh, east of the Orontes, hidden from the approaching Egyptian column. Rameses II, young and ambitious, marches north from Canaan with 4 divisions strung out along the road, separated by kilometers of difficult terrain. 2 captured Hittite scouts, likely planted deliberately, tell the pharaoh that the Hittite army is far to the north near Aleppo. Rameses believes them. He presses ahead with only his lead division, the Amun, and establishes camp northwest of Kadesh. The trap springs with devastating precision. As the 2nd Egyptian Division, the Ra, crosses open ground south of the camp, Hittite chariots surge across the Orontes ford and slam into its exposed flank. The Ra division disintegrates, soldiers scatter. The chariot force wheels north and crashes into the pharaoh's own camp, where chaos erupts among half-deployed troops and panicking horses. Rameses finds himself surrounded, cut off from his remaining divisions still marching hours behind. What follows is contested by every surviving account, yet the broad shape emerges from both Egyptian and Hittite records. Rameses rallies his personal guard and household troops, launching a desperate counterattack westward toward the river. The Hittite chariot crews, rather than pressing their advantage to annihilate the pharaoh, appear to lose cohesion. Some accounts suggest they pause to loot the Egyptian camp, breaking formation at the critical moment. Meanwhile, a detached Egyptian force, the Nerin, arrives unexpectedly from the coastal road and strikes the Hittite chariots from the west. The encirclement breaks. Fighting continues through the afternoon in a swirling, indecisive melee around the camp. By evening, the remaining Egyptian divisions finally reach the field. Muwatalli, who has held his infantry reserve east of the river throughout the battle, chooses not to commit them for a final assault. The reasons remain debated. Perhaps the failing light, perhaps the arrival of fresh Egyptian troops, perhaps a calculated judgment that the strategic objective has already been achieved. Kadesh itself remains firmly in Hittite hands. Both kings claim victory. Rameses commissions enormous temple reliefs at Abu Simbel, Karnak, Luxor, and the Ramesseum, depicting himself as a lone hero scattering Hittite hordes by divine strength. These reliefs constitute the most detailed battle narrative surviving from the ancient world. The Hittite account, preserved in fragmentary cuneiform at Hattusa, is far more restrained, but emphasizes that Rameses retreated and Kadesh was never taken. Neither side achieves a decisive breakthrough. The border between the two empires remains essentially unchanged. The aftermath unfolds across the following years in continued skirmishing across Syria, with neither power able to dislodge the other. Muwatalli relocates his capital temporarily southward to Tarhuntasa, closer to the Syrian theatre, a sign of how consuming this rivalry has become. The battle proves that the two greatest powers of the Bronze Age are locked in a strategic equilibrium that military force alone cannot resolve. The road forward will require something unprecedented, not another charge of chariots, but a document written in clay and sealed in silver. That document arrives after 15 years of exhaustion. The road from Kadesh to peace winds through a generation of inconclusive border wars, dynastic upheaval within Hattusa itself, and a slowly dawning recognition on both sides of the Orontes that the cost of perpetual confrontation exceeds any conceivable gain. By the late 1260s, before the Common Era, the geopolitical landscape has shifted in ways that make reconciliation not merely desirable, but urgent. Assyria, under its aggressive kings, presses against the Hittite eastern frontier with increasing confidence. Egypt, stretched thin across its Levantine holdings, faces restless vassals and Libyan pressure along the western delta. Two empires that once hurled chariots at each other now share a common interest in stability. The man who seizes this moment on the Hittite side is Hattusili III, a king who came to power not through orderly succession, but through a palace coup against his nephew Urhi-Teshub. His legitimacy is contested, and he knows it. A treaty with the most powerful kingdom on earth would do more than secure a border. It would confirm his right to rule in the eyes of every vassal and rival watching from the margins. Rameses II, now decades into his reign, possesses the confidence of a pharaoh who has nothing left to prove on the battlefield. Both rulers are pragmatists shaped by long experience. The negotiations unfold through an extraordinary exchange of letters carried by royal messengers across hundreds of miles. Clay tablets travel between Hattusa and Pi-Rameses, drafted in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the Bronze Age, and reviewed by scribes fluent in the legal traditions of both courts. Hittite Queen Puduhepa plays a role almost without precedent, corresponding directly with the Egyptian court, reviewing treaty drafts, and applying her own seal alongside her husband's. She is not merely a consort, but a co-architect of the peace. The final treaty, concluded around 1259 before the Common Era, is inscribed on a silver tablet sent from Hattusa to Egypt, while an Egyptian version travels north. The Hittite text, preserved in cuneiform copies found in the Hattusa archives, and the Egyptian version, carved in hieroglyphs on temple walls at Karnak, represent the earliest known international peace agreement to survive in both parties' records. The terms are remarkably sophisticated. Both powers agree to mutual non-aggression. They pledge defensive alliance. If either is attacked by a third party, the other will send military aid. They establish an extradition clause for political refugees, though with a humane provision that returned fugitives shall not be punished. They invoke the gods of both lands as witnesses, listing Hittite storm deities and Egyptian solar gods side by side in a theological framework of shared obligation. The treaty inaugurates a period of genuine warmth between the two courts. Diplomatic gifts flow in both directions: gold, lapis lazuli, fine textiles, medicinal plants, and skilled physicians. Letters between the royal families take on an almost familial tone, with Puduhepa addressing Rameses with a directness that suggests real diplomatic partnership rather than mere formality. The peace is further cemented roughly 13 years after the treaty, when a Hittite princess journeys south to marry Rameses, accompanied by a vast dowry caravan. Egyptian texts celebrate the event with elaborate reliefs showing the princess arriving under divine protection, her father's kingdom transformed from mortal enemy into honored ally. This marriage is not merely symbolic. It binds the two dynasties in blood and creates a web of obligation that discourages future conflict. A second Hittite princess may have followed years later. The diplomatic correspondence reveals ongoing negotiations about trade, border management, and mutual recognition that function almost like a modern bilateral relationship conducted through clay and courier. The treaty holds. For the remaining decades of both kingdoms' coexistence, no major conflict erupts between them. The Syrian frontier stabilizes. Vassal states along the border operate within a recognized framework. The Bronze Age international system reaches its most articulated form, a world where great powers communicate through written law, where peace is not merely the absence of war, but a negotiated architecture maintained through marriage, correspondence, and shared divine sanction. It is a remarkable achievement, fragile and human, resting on clay tablets and the good faith of mortal kings. And it endures just long enough to witness the world it was built to protect begin to unravel. Behind that architecture of peace stands a figure whose authority rivals any king's. The treaty between Hatti and Egypt bears not only the seal of Hattusili III, but also the seal of his queen, Puduhepa, her name pressed into silver alongside his, her divine patrons invoked beside his gods. No other Bronze Age civilization produces a document of such magnitude carrying a woman's authority as co-guarantor. This is not ceremonial decoration. Puduhepa wields genuine political power, and the clay record of Hattusa preserves her voice with extraordinary clarity. She comes from Kizzuwatna, the Hurrian-influenced region along Anatolia's southeastern frontier, daughter of a priest of the goddess Ishtar. Hattusili encounters her during his campaigns in the region and takes her as his wife before he seizes the throne. When he does claim kingship, deposing his nephew Urhi-Teshub in a palace coup that he justifies through elaborate theological argument, Puduhepa stands beside him, not as a passive consort, but as a co-regent. Their joint seal impressions depict the king embraced by the storm god and the queen embraced by the sun goddess of Arinna, two parallel channels of divine legitimacy flowing into a single ruling partnership. The surviving correspondence reveals the scope of her activity. Puduhepa writes directly to Rameses II, negotiating the terms of the diplomatic marriage that will send a Hittite princess to Egypt. She writes to the Egyptian queen Nefertari, and Nefertari writes back, a correspondence between two of the most powerful women in the Bronze Age world. When negotiations stall over dowry arrangements, it is Puduhepa who addresses the delays, explaining with pointed dignity that a fire has destroyed the royal treasury and that preparations require time. The tone is neither submissive nor aggressive. It is the voice of a sovereign managing affairs of state. Her religious influence proves equally profound. Puduhepa undertakes a systematic reorganization of the Hittite pantheon, harmonizing the older Hatti traditions with the Hurrian deities she brings from her homeland. She composes prayers of remarkable personal intensity, addressing the sun goddess directly, pleading for her husband's health, offering theological arguments for divine intervention. These texts survive in the Hattusa archives, among the most intimate religious documents of the ancient Near East. The title she holds, Tawananna, carries independent constitutional weight. The Tawananna is not simply the king's wife. She serves as chief priestess of the state religion, administers her own economic estates, maintains her own seal, and retains her title even after her husband's death, continuing to function as a political force into the next reign. This institutional power sometimes generates fierce conflict. Earlier Hittite history records bitter disputes between reigning kings and dowager Tawanannas who refused to relinquish authority. Hittite law itself reflects a society where women possess rights unusual for the Bronze Age. Women can own property, initiate divorce under certain circumstances, and serve as witnesses in legal proceedings. Priestesses hold temple offices with real administrative responsibility. Royal women conduct diplomatic correspondence, manage cult reforms, and participate in treaty negotiations as recognized parties. Puduhepa's influence extends into the reign of her son, Tudalia IV. She remains active in religious and political affairs, her seal continuing to appear on official documents. The archive preserves her voice across decades, praying, negotiating, reforming, governing. She is not an anomaly, but the fullest expression of an institutional role that the Hittite state builds into its constitutional fabric. The rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya, carved into the limestone outcrop near Hattusa, bears the imprint of her religious vision. The procession of gods and goddesses sculpted into its chamber walls reflects the syncretic theology she champions. Hurrian and Hatti deities marching together in divine order, the storm god and sun goddess meeting at the chamber's center. It is a pantheon reorganized under her guidance, frozen in stone. Yet even this extraordinary partnership operates within a world growing more fragile. The treasury fire Puduhepa mentions to Ramesses hints at material strain. The elaborate diplomatic marriages require resources the empire can increasingly ill afford. The queen's prayers for her husband's health suggest a court aware of its own vulnerability. Power, even shared power, even power exercised with intelligence and devotion, cannot hold forever against the pressures gathering beyond the walls. Those pressures arrive with terrible precision in the reign of Tudalia IV, who ascends the throne around 1240 before the Common Era and inherits an empire whose seams are pulling apart on every frontier simultaneously. The son of Hattusili III and Puduhepa, he possesses his mother's intelligence and his father's political instinct, but the world he governs no longer responds to diplomacy alone. The grain crisis strikes first and hardest. The Anatolian plateau, always marginal for agriculture, suffers a sequence of failed harvests that leaves the imperial granaries dangerously low. Letters dispatched to allied and vassal states carry an urgency bordering on desperation. A tablet addressed to the king of Ugarit states the matter plainly. Grain is a matter of life and death. Ships must carry wheat across the eastern Mediterranean from Egypt, from the Nile surplus that has sustained international trade for generations. The massive storage silos of Hattusa, once symbols of imperial abundance, now echo with shortage. Rationing becomes policy. The empire that fed armies and festival processions struggles to feed its own capital. From the east, Assyria presses with renewed aggression. Tukulti-Ninurta I, ambitious and militarily formidable, challenges Hittite authority over the upper Euphrates region. The confrontation culminates at the Battle of Nihria, somewhere along the contested frontier, and the result is catastrophic for Hatti. The Hittites suffer a decisive defeat, losing control of territories that had anchored their eastern diplomatic network for generations. Assyrian power now reaches into lands where Hittite vassal treaties once held absolute authority. The balance of power that Suppiluliuma had constructed a century earlier fractures irreparably. To the west, Anatolia churns with instability. The lands of Arzawa, Lucca, and the Sehar River territory resist centralized control with increasing boldness. Tudalia campaigns westward, but each pacification proves temporary. The empire lacks the manpower to garrison every restive province, while simultaneously defending against Kaska raiders in the north and Assyrian encroachment in the east. Military resources stretch across too many fronts. The copper trade from Al-Ashia, the island known today as Cyprus, falters as maritime routes grow insecure. Correspondence between Hattusa and the rulers of Al-Ashia reveals mutual anxiety about ships that fail to arrive, about metal shipments delayed or lost entirely. Copper is essential for bronze production, and bronze remains the foundation of military and economic power. Without reliable supply, the empire's workshops slow, its arsenals thin. Tudalia responds with monumental construction at Hattusa, expanding the fortification circuit to encompass the upper city, adding massive defensive walls with towers and elaborate gate complexes. The Sphinx Gate and the underground postern tunnel speak to engineering confidence, yet the very scale of defensive building betrays the depth of insecurity driving it. A kingdom certain of its dominance does not pour resources into walls. At Yazilikaya, the open-air rock sanctuary receives its final sculptural program under Tudalia's patronage. The procession of deities carved into the living stone achieves its most complete form, and a separate chamber bears the king's own cartouche embraced by the protective god Sharuma. It is a statement of divine legitimacy, made precisely when earthly legitimacy trembles. The theological synthesis Puduhepa championed reaches its artistic culmination, even as the political order it sanctifies erodes. Trade embargo becomes a weapon of state policy. Tudalia attempts to blockade Assyria by forbidding his vassals from conducting commerce with the eastern rival, a strategy preserved in treaty amendments that reveal how thoroughly economic warfare has entered imperial calculations. Yet enforcement proves nearly impossible across the vast distances and fractured loyalties of the late empire. The administrative tablets from this period multiply in number and narrow in scope. Smaller disputes, local shortages, garrison complaints, unpaid obligations. The bureaucratic machinery still functions, still stamps its seals and files its records, but the documents themselves testify to contraction. The empire governs less territory with more effort. Provincial governors exercise greater autonomy. Vassal kings calculate whether Hattusa can still enforce its treaties. Tudalia IV dies around 1209 before the Common Era, leaving a throne that his successors will occupy for barely a single generation more. The walls he built still stand. The gods he carved still march in stone procession. But the grain ships arrive less frequently. The frontiers bend inward, and across the eastern Mediterranean, Forces are gathering that no fortification, however massive, will withstand. Anuwanda III holds the throne only briefly, a reign so short that the archives preserve almost nothing of his acts. Then Suppiluliuma II, the last king whose name the tablets record, takes power around 1207 before the Common Era. He inherits a kingdom already hollowed by the pressures his father could not reverse: grain deficits, fractured vassal networks, an Assyrian frontier that no longer yields to diplomacy. Yet this final king is no passive figure. The tablets credit him with military victories, including naval engagements off the coast of Al-Ashia, battles fought on water in a manner almost unprecedented for Hittite arms. He claims triumph. He records it in stone. But the sea he fights upon is already churning with forces that dwarf any single fleet. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the world is unraveling. Ugarit, the great port kingdom on the Syrian coast and a loyal Hittite vassal, sends desperate letters to Al-Ashia describing enemy ships sighted offshore. One tablet, found baked hard in the fire that consumed the city, pleads that all troops and chariots are stationed in Hittite territory, that the city stands defenseless. The letter was never sent. Ugarit burns around 1185 before the Common Era, its harbor quarter reduced to ash, its royal palace collapsed into rubble. The destruction is total and permanent. The city never recovers. The identity of the destroyers remains one of history's most debated questions. Egyptian records at Medinet Habu name coalitions of peoples: Peleset, Jekka, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, moving by land and sea, displacing populations, toppling kingdoms. Whether these sea peoples constitute organized invasion forces or represent the chaotic movement of displaced communities driven by famine, drought, and cascading state failures remains uncertain. What is certain is the result. Kingdom after kingdom across the Levantine coast falls silent. Trade networks that connected Egypt, Hatti, Assyria, Babylon, and the Aegean shatter within a single generation. Hattusa itself meets its end around 1180 before the Common Era. The archaeological evidence reveals selective burning. The royal citadel of Büyükkale, the great temple district, administrative buildings consumed by fire. Yet curiously, the destruction appears partly deliberate. Valuable objects seem to have been removed before the burning. Some scholars suggest the city was abandoned and torched by its own departing population, or by Kaska raiders descending from the northern highlands into a capital already emptied of its garrison. No foreign conqueror left an inscription claiming the prize. No victorious army recorded the fall. Hattusa simply ceases. The great grain silos stand empty. The tablet archives lie buried under collapsed mud brick, their thousands of cuneiform texts sealed in darkness for 3 millennia. The Lion Gate and the Sphinx Gate endure as stone sentinels over a city with no inhabitants. The rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya, where the gods of Hatti march in eternal procession, receives no more offerings. The festival calendar that once regulated the sacred year falls silent. The collapse is not unique to Hatti. Mycenaean Greece fragments into isolated communities. The Kassite dynasty of Babylon falters. Egypt survives but contracts, losing its Asiatic empire permanently. The interconnected Bronze Age system, built on tin roots from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, grain from Egypt, diplomacy conducted in Akkadian cuneiform, disintegrates. The world that Suppiluliuma I had dominated, that Hattusili III had stabilized through treaty, that Tudhaliya IV had desperately defended, simply ceases to function as a coherent international order. In the ashes of Hattusa, wind moves through roofless temples. Rain slowly dissolves the unbaked tablets that no one thought to fire in kilns. The fortification walls, engineered to withstand siege armies, stand guard over emptiness. The empire that had rivaled Egypt, pioneered international law, and governed through 1,000 gods, vanishes from human memory so completely that for 3,000 years no one will know it ever existed. But the empire's death is not the death of its people. Across southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, in cities that had served as provincial capitals and vassal seats, fragments of Hittite civilization survive the catastrophe and begin to reconstitute themselves into something new. Carchemish, perched on the western bank of the Euphrates, never falls to the fires that consume Hattusa. Its ruling dynasty, descended from the royal house that Suppiluliuma I installed 2 centuries earlier, continues to govern without interruption. The city's massive fortification walls still stand. Its scribes still carve Luwian hieroglyphs into basalt orthostats. Its kings still invoke the storm god. In the wreckage of the Bronze Age world, Carchemish becomes the most important inheritor of Hittite political tradition. It is not alone. Across a belt of territory stretching from the Taurus Mountains to the Orontes Valley, a constellation of small kingdoms emerges from the imperial collapse. Malatya commands the upper Euphrates crossing. Tabal controls the central Anatolian plateau south of the old heartland. Quay occupies the fertile Cilician plain. Hamath rises along the Orontes in inland Syria. Aleppo, ancient seat of the storm god, maintains its sacred traditions under new rulers. Each kingdom is independent, each is small compared to the vanished empire, yet each preserves recognizable elements of Hittite heritage: religious iconography, royal titulature, administrative practices, and above all the Luwian hieroglyphic script that now replaces cuneiform as the primary medium of monumental inscription. These Neo-Hittite states inhabit a transformed world. The international system of great powers has shattered. Egypt has retreated behind its borders. Babylon struggles under Kassite and then Elamite pressure. Assyria, temporarily weakened, has not yet begun its great imperial expansion. Into this vacuum flow, the Aramaeans, Semitic-speaking tribal groups who migrate westward from the Syrian steppe in waves during the 11th and 10th centuries before the Common Era. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms do not simply resist Aramaean pressure, they absorb it. Intermarriage between Luwian-speaking elites and Aramaean populations produces hybrid cultures. Bilingual inscriptions appear, carved in both Luwian hieroglyphs and Aramaic alphabetic script. At Hamath, Aramaean dynasties eventually take power while preserving elements of Hittite artistic and religious tradition. The gate reliefs of Carchemish reveal this cultural continuity most vividly. Processions of gods and kings march across basalt slabs in a style that descends directly from imperial Hittite rock carving, yet incorporates Aramaean and Assyrian influences. The storm god still rides his bull. Kings still perform libation rituals before divine symbols. Luwian hieroglyphic inscriptions record building dedications, military victories, and divine invocations in formulas that echo the great treaties and annals of the imperial period. This world of small kingdoms endures for roughly 4 centuries, longer than the Hittite Empire itself had lasted. But the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 9th century before the Common Era brings mounting pressure. Ashurnaserpal II and Sholmaneser III extract tribute from the Western states. By the late 8th century, Assyrian patience for independent vassals expires entirely. Tiglath-Pileser III annexes several kingdoms outright. Sargon II completes the process, conquering Carchemish in 717 before the Common Era and transforming it into an Assyrian provincial capital. Hamath falls the same decade. Tabal and Kui are absorbed. The last politically independent bearers of Hittite tradition vanish into the Assyrian administrative system. Yet even this is not complete erasure. The Hebrew Bible preserves references to Hittites living in Canaan and Syria, echoes of these very kingdoms filtered through Israelite memory. Luwian hieroglyphic writing influences the development of other Anatolian scripts. Religious traditions seep into Phrygian and later Anatolian cultures. The storm god of Aleppo continues to receive worship long after the last Neo-Hittite king loses his throne. What the great collapse of 1180 scattered, these successor states gathered and carried forward across 4 centuries of quiet persistence, ensuring that the civilization born on the Anatolian plateau did not vanish entirely when its capital burned. For 3,000 years, silence. The great capital lies buried beneath wind-blown soil and scrub grass on the Anatolian plateau, its name forgotten, its archives sealed under collapsed mud brick and ash. No classical Greek historian mentions the Hittites by name. No Roman traveler records their monuments. The civilization that once treated with Egypt as an equal, that fielded thousands of chariots across Syria, that codified law and pioneered international diplomacy, simply ceases to exist in human memory. Only those faint biblical references to Hittites in Canaan linger, puzzling scholars who cannot reconcile scattered tribal mentions with anything resembling a great power. The rediscovery begins not at Hattusa, but in Syria. In 1812, the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt notices a stone covered in unfamiliar hieroglyphic script embedded in a bizarre wall in Hamath. Decades later, in 1872, Irish missionary William Wright and local officials extract the Hamath stones, sending them to Istanbul. Scholars recognize that these inscriptions belong to no known writing system. Simultaneously, travelers in central Anatolia report massive ruins near the Turkish village of Boğazköy. Cyclopean walls, carved gate figures, rock-cut chambers filled with mysterious reliefs. The site at Yazilikaya, with its procession of gods carved into living rock, draws particular attention. Something enormous once stood here, but no one yet understands what. The breakthrough arrives in 1906. The German Assyriologist Hugo Winkler, following earlier soundings by Ernest Chantre, begins systematic excavation at Boğazköy. Within weeks, his team uncovers thousands of cuneiform tablets in the ruins of the royal citadel at Büyükale. Among them is a document Winkler recognizes immediately, the Akkadian version of a treaty between a Hittite king and Rameses II of Egypt. The other copy, carved in hieroglyphs, already stands on a temple wall at Karnak. Winkler has found Hattusa, the lost capital of an empire that scholars had barely dared to imagine existed. Yet the tablets remain largely unreadable. Most are written not in Akkadian, but in an unknown language using cuneiform signs. The decipherment falls to Bedřich Hrozný, a Czech linguist working in Vienna. In 1915, amid the devastation of the First World War, Hrozný publishes his demonstration that Hittite is an Indo-European language, the oldest attested member of that vast family. A single sentence about bread and water unlocks a civilization. Suddenly, thousands of tablets begin to speak. Royal annals, law codes, ritual texts, diplomatic correspondence, mythological narratives, land grants, and festival calendars pour forth from the archives of a power dead for over 3 millennia. Excavations continue throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, expanding understanding with every season. The Great Temple District reveals a city of extraordinary religious complexity. Massive grain silos demonstrate imperial logistics. Seal impressions reconstruct networks of governance spanning from the Aegean coast to the upper Euphrates. The Hittite law code, with its preference for restitution over mutilation, astonishes legal historians. The vassal treaties, with their elaborate blessings and curses, illuminate the mechanics of Bronze Age statecraft. Perhaps the most resonant legacy stands in the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, where a replica of the Kadesh Treaty hangs on the wall, recognized as the earliest known international peace agreement. A civilization forgotten for 3,000 years now symbolizes the very principle of diplomatic resolution between rival powers. The storm god's people, who once ruled from their fortress on the bend of the Kazilamac, speak again through clay and stone, reminding the modern world that the foundations of law, diplomacy, and pluralistic governance reach far deeper into human history than anyone once imagined. Thank you for joining this journey through the full arc of the Hittite Empire. If these stories of the ancient world have sparked your curiosity, consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss the next expedition into history's forgotten chapters.